Welcome to AI Horror Stories. Would you believe it if you were told your uncle had a rematch with a Nahual? A Nahual that was half animal, half human, with red fire in its eyes? And what happens when you have to face it yourself? So, do you want to know what really happened that night? Then keep listening to AI Horror Stories. The story name is Rematch. This happened to me a couple of years ago. I was going to turn 17. It was something so strange and terrifying at the same time that I still can't understand it completely. There is a part of me that still refuses to accept that what I lived it was real, but you judge. All this started when my parents told us that we would visit Aunt Lupe and Uncle Manuel, my dad's older brother, the following weekend. He lives in a ranch very close to Zalapa, Veracruz. Neither my sister nor I had the pleasure of meeting them in person, only we had seen in the old photographs that my father sometimes showed us his family, whom we hardly visited precisely because they were very retired. At first I didn't like the idea very much. I had training on Saturday in the morning and in the afternoon I would see my boyfriend, but I knew that my parents really wanted to go, so I cancelled my commitments. Just like that weekend arrived. We put our suitcases in the car and went to our uncle's house. The ranch was on a hill. To get there we still had to climb a hill narrow path of yellow dirt. The car fit well, but it was a bit dangerous on the side of the ravine, which led to a river, although I had to admit that the view from there was spectacular. As soon as we parked in front of the ranch, my uncles came out to greet us. My Aunt Lupe was short, her hair was all gray and her features were sweet. She smiled at us when she saw us and my parents ran hug her. My Uncle Manuel was a tall and serious man. He didn't look like he was 70 years old, he looked very whole for his age. He gave us a hurried hug. That afternoon after eating, they spent the whole time talking. I stayed with my parents for a while and then we went out to collect firewood in the surrounding area to make a bonfire. As soon as it got dark we all went to sit around the fire. My Aunt Lupe had prepared champorado and there we all walked with our jugs serving us. The night seemed very calm. But then howls began to be heard in the distance, among the hills that surrounded the ranch. At that moment I realized that my uncle stirred restlessly. The howls they continued listening for another few minutes and then they fell silent. Even so my Uncle Manuel got up from his chair, hurried into the house, and when he returned with us he had a rifle on his shoulder. When my father saw him, he commented that maybe that animal had already left because it was no longer listening. The uncle told him that he was sure that this animal would come, but that this time it would not catch him off guard. It would be his revenge, and he continued long towards the corrals. We stood looking at each other without understanding what he meant by the revenge. After a while we saw him leave there and head towards the fields that were at the back of the corral. The house, we just watched it in silence from the bonfire. It was then that Aunt Lupe told us that that howl was apparently from a Nahual, and that Uncle Manuel had already faced it on other occasions, but that he always escaped with one of his animals, and that he had already made it personal, because a few weeks ago that animal had tried to enter the house when we were away, and when he couldn't, it had stolen a sheep and had destroyed part of the corn field. My sister and I were looking at each other surprised. My father and mother commented to the aunt that all that about the Nahuals were just legends for scare people. What could be is that there was a coyote or a wolf out there looking for something to eat. At that moment the guy came back. He seemed more serious than we were used to and told us that it was best we had to go into the house. Neither my parents nor my grandmother gave any objections. We went in so quickly that we didn't even put out the campfire. As soon as we entered they sent us to the room they had given us to sleep in, but more it took us a while to go to bed than to get up scared. Outside we could hear a lot of commotion from the side of the corrals. When we left the room still we could hear Uncle Manuel cursing his luck and how the door was slammed. When we got to the room was only my mother and Aunt Lupe. We didn't know what to do at the moment, when suddenly we heard several gunshots. We were scared. The grandmother told us not to be scared, that the most likely thing is that the uncle had shot into the air to scare the Nahual. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere became more tense. Suddenly the door opened with a bang. It was my father. His leg was dragging. We ran to help him. Between my sister and I sat him in the nearest chair. Big room in the room. He was bleeding a lot. Aunt Lupe grabbed one of the bottles of mezcal that she had on a shelf, opened it and poured part of the contents into the wound. even though he tried to hold on, my dad gave an impressive scream and fainted. My mother, all distraught, asked her aunt where we could go to get him treated. Aunt Lupe told us that only as far as the town, that there we could find a doctor. My mom woke up my dad with a pat on the face, and my sister and I helped him get to the car, but we had barely been able to get it in when we heard gunshots and a horrible scream again. Until that moment we remembered the uncle again. Manuel, I told my mother and my sister to take my father to the doctor, that I would go look for Uncle Manuel. My mother started the car and got lost on the sidewalk. At that moment I saw Aunt Lupe come out with a shotgun in her hands. She was ready to look for the uncle. I stopped her and I almost had to snatch the gun from her, and then I ran towards the corrals. When I entered, I got an unbearable smell that almost made me vomit. Since it was very dark, I stepped on something slippery on the floor and fell flat. I took out my phone and turned on the lamp. I wouldn't have done it. In front of me there was a butchered animal, and what I had stepped on was its blood spread all over the floor. I got up as best I could, horrified, and when I left I had to stop because I started vomiting. At that moment I heard the guy's screams, Manuel again. Then I ran to the fields. I went into the cornfields and I started to shout at the uncle, but he never answered me, so I stayed silent to see if I could hear him again. They were very distressing minutes. I felt like my heart was thundering very loudly in my chest, and at that moment I heard some grunts in front of me. I ran with all my strength towards that place. When I removed the last cornfields from my face I stayed frozen and a chill ran through my entire body. In front of me was a huge animal. On top of my uncle, it looked like a dog or a wolf. It had on its hairy back something that looked like horns. Its hind legs were visible. Very thin. Looked more like the legs of a goat. It had one of its claws buried in my uncle's shoulder, and the other claw was on top of his head as if he were going to hit him. At that moment he raised his horrible face towards me. He seemed almost human, but instead of a mouth he seemed to have a snout, half open and full of yellowish fangs. He looked at me for a moment with those eyes demonic reds. It was until that moment that I realized that I had never touched a weapon in my life. I was terrified. I didn't even know how to hold it, and that animal seemed to understand it. For a moment I felt like it was making fun of me. And he returned his attention to my uncle. I was so desperate that I don't know how it all happened. I only remember that I grabbed the shotgun very tightly by the barrel with both hands and that I raised it above me as high as I could. Then I hit the head of that animal with all my strength. I only heard like a crunch. That beast slowly stood up on its hind legs. It was huge. My head barely reached its height. Chest. He looked at me with those burning red eyes, and at that moment I saw how a lot of blood began to drip onto his face. He snorted very loudly a couple of times, turned around and went into the cornfields. At that moment I heard a moan. It was my uncle. I knelt down to help him get up, and we went very slowly towards the house. In the distance we saw my Aunt Lupe, who was at the door with a machete in her hand. When she saw us she ran to help me. Between the two of us we took him to the living room and sat him on the couch. I hadn't realized, but all my clothes were stained with blood. I started to check myself to see if I didn't have any wounds. My Aunt Lupe took off Uncle Manuel's jacket and shirt and applied the same mezcal to him. The uncle only gritted his teeth but did not scream. My uncles were very rough people. Then she cleaned and checked his wounds. He put a piece of aloe vera wrapped in another herb that he didn't know and let it rest for a moment before starting to suture it. At that moment my uncle asked me to sit next to him, and with his free hand he began to suture me. Explain how to remove the safety from the shotgun, and then he showed me where I had to look to shoot and where I should load it again. Then he looked at me and smiled at me. He thanked me for having saved him life, and he promised me that he would teach me how to shoot. A short time later we heard the car. I ran to see how my dad was. He had part of his leg and thigh bandaged. They also had to give him several stitches, but his injuries were not dangerous. Between my sister and I helped him enter the house. When he saw my uncle he asked him if he was okay. The uncle told him yes. Then he paused and he told him that he was very sorry for having put our lives in danger. That same afternoon we returned home, so that my father could have the necessary care. The following year we returned and my Uncle Manuel kept his promise to teach me how to shoot. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share for more terrifying tales.